أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. سيقول السفهاء من الناس ما ولاهم عن قبلتهم التي كانوا عليها، قل لله المشرق والمغرب يهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس ويكون الرسول عليكم شهيدا. وما جعلنا القبلة التي كنت عليها إلا لنعلم من يتبع الرسول ممن ينقلب على عقبيه، وإن كانت لكبيرة إلا على الذين هدى الله، وما كان الله ليضيع إيمانكم إن الله بالناس لرؤوف رحيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات اللهم صل على محمد. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وعجل فرجه. For the hastening and the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil faraja. We will continue with the topic that we had started discussing last night. Of course, again, we offer our condolences on the shahada of our beloved Imam. Last night we started discussing this topic that we had given the title of Exploring the Reasons Behind Islamic Rulings 2. And we started the discussion from this point that fundamentally the human being is different from every other creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The human being is different from the other animals, it is different from the plants, it is different from every other creature in the sense that it has the capability that when it sees natural phenomena, for example, when it observes something happening in this world, it will start to ask questions. And these questions are aimed at trying to figure out the reality and the wisdom and the philosophy behind this phenomenon that the human being had observed. When the apple fell from the tree, the human being did not stop there. He started to ask why. And we said the same asking of why also applies to religious phenomena as well. When the human being is told as a Muslim that he has to believe in one God, that the Quran is a miracle, that Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah, for example, he asks why, and he should ask why. When he is told, for example, that he has to pray 5 times a day, he asks the same question and raises the same issue as well. And we said we wanted to see what is Islam's take on this issue. Fundamentally, does Islam see this in a positive light or in a negative light? We said when we go back to the very beginning of the creation of mankind, we find an instance where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows for the angels to raise their questions, to raise their concerns, not in the sense of objecting to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was doing, but more so in the sense of trying to understand the wisdom and the philosophy behind the creation of this human being, that some of his children at least are going to create corruption on earth. Beyond that, we went into the seerah of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt. We find that this occurrence of their companions coming to them and asking them why, what is the reason behind these rulings that they tell them to act upon, is a very common occurrence. So much so that even in some of the most unusual situations, Ali ibn Abi Talib used to respond to the questions of people. Before the battle of Jamal was going to begin, one would come to him and ask him a question. Other companions could not even take this, but Ali used to tell them, no, we have to answer these questions. These questions are important to answer. And beyond that, scholars of ours have compiled these ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, where the Ahlul Bayt have shed light on the reasons behind Islamic rulings in books. One of them, if not the most important of them, is a book of Shaykh al-Saduq by the name and the title of Ilal al-Shara'i', the reason behind the legislation. So in the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt and the Quran, you also find this as well. But we said there are two different types of whys, two different types of questions that we ask. Sometimes we ask this question, and what we mean is, what is the hadith? What is the proof for it? What is the verse of the Quran for it? Whereas sometimes we ask why, and what we mean is the wisdom, the philosophy, the benefit behind this ruling. These two are very different from one another. The first, we said you always have to ask either yourself or you have to have someone who's asking on your behalf at the very least. That would be your marja'. And the second category, we said also here we find that there is no problem whatsoever in terms of people asking this question. If I pray 4 rakats, is it okay for me to ask why? What is the wisdom behind it? There seems to be no problem in this regard within Islam. Yes, there is one situation where asking this question is a problem, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has objected to it in His verses, and that is when I ask as a contingency. Meaning that if you make it make sense to me, then I will obey you. But if you mention a reason that doesn't make sense to me, or you don't mention any reason at all, then I'm not going to practice this part of the religion. This approach, we said that this approach is not where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from us. And beyond this, we said when we look at the rulings that we have in Islam, many of them, or some of them rather, we might know the reasons behind them. Many of them, and I would argue most of them, we don't know the reason behind them. Yes, the general concepts we have in Islam, prayer, fasting, giving charity, these we understand the general reasons behind them. But the moment you start talking about details, then we don't know the reasons behind a lot of these details. Why is it that when I do wudu, my hands cannot go up? All we know is that Zurara asked the 5th or the 6th Imam, and they told him, listen, when you are doing wudu, you have to do what? You have to go downward. Zurara says, I watched the Imam took water, he was pouring water, he went down, he never went upwards. That's all we know. But what's the wisdom behind it? What's the philosophy behind it? We may not know. And the more you go into the details of Islam, the more questions like this pop up. And this is why we mentioned that as a parent, and we'll talk more about parents today as well, but as a parent, I should never raise my child as one who needs a reason in the sense of a benefit or a wisdom for every single act of worship that he wants to carry out. Because if I teach religion in this way, I will definitely fail. Why? Because there are so many rulings in Islam that we don't know the reason behind them. And we ended with this question, that why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't just make things easier for us and explain the reasons behind all Islamic rulings? You and I, our capabilities are limited, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's unlimited. He has all the power in the world. If He wanted to, couldn't He have just explained every time He sends down a ruling, the wisdom with it as well? When I tell you to do wudu this way, this is the reason behind it. When I tell you that you have to do sajda on a turba, this is the reason behind it, and so on and so forth. This is where we ended our discussion yesterday. Tonight, inshallah, to delve deeper into this discussion, we'll pose the following questions. Number one, why hasn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with His unlimited power and authority, shared with us the reason behind every single Islamic ruling that He expects us to act upon. And what are the common answers that people give to this question that in fact are not accurate and they are not true at all? Number two, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for 13 plus years, more than 13 years, ask the Muslims to pray towards Jerusalem and towards Baytul Muqaddas? And then after 13 plus years, tell them now you have to change and now you have to pray towards where? You have to pray towards the Kaaba and you have to pray towards Mecca. Number three, how are some rulings within the religion of Islam legislated with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeping the community and the society in mind as opposed to simply legislating the ruling for the individual? Number four, why is it that sometimes there are types of music, for example, that are haram, even though for me personally, it does not create any sort of negative effect. At least when I listen to it, I might not feel like it has any negative effect on me. And yet, my marja, for example, might say it is still not allowed for me to listen to this type of music. Why is that? And number five, the last question, is it possible that the rulings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislates for us, sometimes we might be able to think about one or two of the reasons behind them. But is there a possibility that there are other reasons that I do not know about? Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 5 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. Let's begin from here. Why couldn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala simply share these rulings with us? It would have made life so much easier. Yes, my faith would have increased in Him. Every time I wanted to tell my friend about my religion, I could have just told him, this is why we do things this way. This is why we wake up when everybody is asleep in the morning. This is why we wake up. Yes, it's not because we're weird. It's because there's a reason behind it. Yes. Someone might say, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala couldn't have done this because if He wanted to do this, He would have to share it with you in the Quran. And if He wanted to share it with you in the Quran, then this Quran, instead of 6,000 verses, would turn into what? 600,000 verses. And these 600 pages with the handwriting of Uthman Taha would turn into 6,000 pages. This is not too much of a valid response, yes? This is a response that we might think about in the moment, but in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have thought of His own way of explaining the rulings and the wisdoms behind them. Someone might say, well, what about Ahlul Bayt? Ahlul Bayt, they could have explained these rulings to us. And in response, and this is a response people normally give in this regard, they will say, yes, the Ahlul Bayt were willing to give all of the knowledge that they had. But people didn't have the capacity to understand the wisdom behind the rulings. This is why Ahlul Bayt also did not share the wisdom behind all of the rulings. Only some of them they have shared with us. This also is not too much of a valid response. Because yes, the people of that time, their capacity was not much. We know about this, and I'll mention hadith about this in just a second. But in reality, if the Ahlul Bayt knew that people were going to come in the future where they would question every single detail of this religion, could they not have shared in more hadith of theirs the reasons behind more of the rulings of Islam, if not all of them at the very least? Yes? Yes, they could have. Did the people of that time have the full capacity? No. In one of these ahadith that we read in Al-Irshad of Shaykh al-Mufid, yes, he says, he narrates from one of these times where Ali ibn Abi Talib went on the mimbar and he said, Saluni qabla an tafqiduni, like we were talking about yesterday. This man got up and he asked Ali ibn Abi Talib, as some of us have famously heard, Ya Ali, tell me how many hairs I have in my hair, on my head, and in my beard. And Ali ibn Abi Talib, based on this narration of Shaykh al-Mufid, responded to him. He said, the Prophet told me that when I get up on here and I say, Saluni qabla an tafqiduni, someone like you will ask this question of me. Meaning that this is a question that has no weight, no value. And it seems as though this person was asking on purpose. Because the tone of Ali ibn Abi Talib was a very harsh one when he was responding to him. He said, I can't tell you, or I don't want to tell you how many hairs you have, because this has no benefit for you. But what does have a benefit for you is that you, with this mindset, at the bottom of every hair of yours, in your head and in your beard, there is a shaitan with you. And in your house, you're raising someone who will kill the grandchild of the Prophet. Who was this person? Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. Who was his son? Umar ibn Sa'ad, who was there, who was the commander of the army on the other side. Yes, Umar ibn Sa'ad was the commander on the other side. So yes, the people of that time, they did not have capacity. If Ali were to tell them, come and ask me, instead of asking the proper questions, what would they come and ask? They would ask these types of things. But still, this is not the best response, because at the end of the day, the Ahlul Bayt have the wisdom to speak of those things that they know believers later on will be in need of. The people right now, they don't understand, they don't have the maturity. But later on, there will be people who will have the maturity and the understanding to understand. They could have at least shared more reasons behind some of these rulings, yes? It seems as though there is a different reason why the Ahlul Bayt and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on purpose, they feel like they don't have to share the reasons behind all of these rulings. There seems to be something else going on here. That is where now we get into the crux of the discussion. Why doesn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala share these rulings and just make life so much easier? Yes? Imagine you would be living in heaven if you knew the reason behind every single ruling that you practiced. Why not? There are two main reasons that I will share with you. The first of the reasons will be broken down into three reasons in and of itself. But the first reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not share with us the reasons behind some of these Islamic rulings is this. It's because if He were to share them with you, you would not accept it from Him. Ya Allah, share with your knowledge with us. Tell us why we have to do things this way. If He were to share it with you, would you accept His opinion? Would you say, yes, Ya Allah, this is the wisdom behind this ruling. You understand better than me. Or would you sit there and argue with Him? Would you sit there and say, no, this doesn't seem like a valid reason. I think I could have come up with a better reason than you. Say, no, Shaykh, if He could only tell us. Well, here's the litmus test. Some rulings He's already told you the reason behind it, and you will not accept it from Him. Hasn't He? He says, for example, man and woman are different from one another. This man, he has these responsibilities. This woman, she has these responsibilities. And you and I sit there, I speak of myself ignorantly, I say, no, they're the same. What is this? Man has these rulings and woman has these different rulings. No, in my opinion, they're the same. They should have the same rights, they have the same responsibilities. Everything should be the same. Well, here He's sharing with you why He has different rulings. Would you accept it from Him? No, you wouldn't accept it from Him. Because when He has already done that, you have your own arguments with Him. He says this man, his test is in lowering his gaze. His dress code is a little bit more flexible because his bigger test is in what? Is in lowering his gaze. This woman, her test, no. Her bigger test is in what? Is in the dress code. The dress codes are different. There's no doubt about this. But you and I sit there and say, no. They should have the same exact duty. And He says, no, I've created these creatures, They're different from one another. And you and I sit there ignorantly and we say, no, I don't think we can agree on this opinion of yours. If He had shared these rulings with you and I, it's not like we're sitting there, sam'an wa ta'atan, we would accept anything that He had to say. No, we have a lot of opinions, mashallah. And there are three different reasons or three different situations where you will find we will argue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where we will feel like the reason He is providing to us, not good enough of a reason. As if He's a human being like you and I. The first of these situations is that sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reason that He mentions for a particular act of worship, the reason that He has in mind for a particular act of worship is no wisdom and no philosophy and no scientific benefit except that it is the perfect test for you, and through this test He will see if you really want to act upon the things that He wants you to do. That's the only reason behind this ruling. There's no scientific benefit. There's no scientific philosophy. It's not this, you connect with the energy in the earth, all of these things. These things might be real. They might not be real. I don't know about these things, yes? But sometimes the reason is simply, I want to see if you're going to obey me or not. You say, where? Where does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislate a ruling? And then the only reason is what? The only reason is, I want to see if my servant will obey me. In this scenario and this incident that has taken place in Islamic history, where the qibla of the Muslimin changed, the Quran literally says the only reason why we did this was what? So that we could see who was on the path of the Prophet and who was going to walk away from the path of the Prophet. What the verse is referring to, and these are the verses that I recited at the beginning, yes? Verses 142 onwards from Surah Al-Baqarah. What the verse is referring to is not the change of the Qibla. What the verse is referring to is why the Muslims were praying towards Baytul Muqaddas before. Because the change of the Qibla, for many, it's already clear what the reason is behind it. The Jews of that time and the Christians of that time, some of them, they used to already pray towards Baytul Muqaddas. And they used to mock the Muslims. Yes? And they used to use this as an excuse that Muhammad, his religion, is reliant upon the religion of the previous prophets. He doesn't have his own religion. They don't have their own independence. Look, they don't even have a holy place to pray towards. They come and pray towards the holy place of ours. For us, this doesn't seem like a serious objection now. But at that time, things are very different. Yes, the logic that was used was very different for people. And the Jews in particular, they used to bring up this issue. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, based on some narrations, in the middle of prayer, Jibreel descended upon the Prophet and moved the Prophet from facing towards Baytul Muqaddas towards where? Towards Mecca. If you take a look at the maps, you will see that this is not a change of 5 degrees or 10 degrees. Because if you look at the map of Arabia today, and you look at where Jerusalem is, and then you look at where Mecca is compared to where Medina is, because this took place in Medina, everyone agrees upon that, yes? When you see that the Prophet was facing towards Baytul Muqaddas, he would have been facing where? Northwest. Now all of a sudden he has to switch where? He has to switch towards the south. 150 degrees, 160 degrees, 180 degrees you might say, of a difference in the direction. And that's why scholars have discussions. Did this happen in the middle of Salat and then the Prophet moved ahead so that the believers moved behind him? Because you may not know that moving, if it's a little bit of moving in the Salat, it does not necessarily make your Salat batil. Certain steps that you take in Salat, it doesn't necessarily make your salat batil. Did the Prophet do this? Or did the command come between prayers? There's discussion on this, and we may not know exactly what happened, yes? But regardless, this was a big difference that happened. We know the wisdom of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala switched from Baytul Muqaddas to Mecca. That's easy. The question is, for 13 years, the believers were praying towards where? They were praying towards Mecca, Baytul Muqaddas. Before they started praying towards where? Towards Mecca. The question is, 13 years, Ya Allah, why did you do this? The Quran says, وَمَا جَعَلْنَا الْقِبْلَةَ الَّتِي كُنْتَ عَلَيْهَا Ya Rasulullah, we did not place Baytul Muqaddas as your initial qibla, except for what? إِلَّا لِنَعْلَمَ. The only reason was this. لِنَعْلَمَ مَنْ يَتَّبِعُ الرَّسُولِ, who is going to follow the Prophet, مِمَّنْ يَنْقَلِبُ عَلَىٰ عَقِبَيْهِ, from the one who was going to walk away from the path of the Prophet. This was the reason. Yes, the reason of the switching, easy, no problem. But you know, this Prophet of yours, he was praying towards Baytul Muqaddas all of these years. It's interesting, think about this. If the Prophet was in Mecca for 13 years, which is the mainstream opinion, and when he came to Medina as well, they say at least a year and a half, some say, that he was still praying towards where? Baytul Muqaddas. Think about this, the Prophet has prayed more towards Baytul Muqaddas than he's prayed towards where? And he's prayed towards Mecca. What about all of these ibadah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, all of this ibadah is just as valuable for me. وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُضِيعَ إِيمَانَكُمْ. We read at the end of verse 143. So all of this is valuable for me. Why? Because he was doing what I told him to do. So we told him to pray towards Baytul Muqaddas. Why? Because there's some sort of energy in Baytul Muqaddas. Maybe not. That's a separate thing. The primary reason, at the very least, that the Quran is saying is we wanted to see would people obey us or not. Sometimes the reason is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just wants to see, are you going to obey or not? That's it. It's the only wisdom behind it. It's the only philosophy behind it. This philosophy is also mentioned by Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Also mentioned by him as it relates to Mecca and Kaaba being in the land of Arabia. Ya Allah, why put this house, this holy house of yours, in this land of Arabia that is barren and it is hot and you can barely find any water, so much so that when you do find water, it's a miracle. Like the spring of Zamzam or the well of Zamzam. Ya Allah, why not put this house somewhere, good weather? I don't know, Bay Area, somewhere else, And Ali ibn Abi Talib says in his khutbahs, he says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose that place on purpose because he wanted to see his servants, would they put themselves through difficulty to go and do ziyarah of his house? Or no, if it's in a good area, the rich and the poor, everyone wants to go there anyways. This may not be the only reason, but Ali ibn Abi Talib says this is one of the reasons why he chose that place. Now, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to tell you, do this, the only reason behind it is because I want to see if you will obey me or not. Is that reason going to be good enough for you? It's not going to be good enough for you. You will sit there and say, no, Ya Allah, it's not good enough. Give me scientific reason. Give me some sort of other wisdom or benefit. No, this is the biggest benefit. No. This is the first situation where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He were to share the reasons behind rulings, we would not accept it from Him, number one. Moving on to number two. The second situation where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the reason behind a ruling, and you and I still will not accept it from Him because of our limits in terms of our knowledge, is because the ruling is set up and legislated for the community. It is legislated for the society. It is legislated for the ummah. It is not legislated for you individually. This is a bit technical. I'm going to need your attention, yes? Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He legislates a ruling individually. He says you can do this if it doesn't create a negative effect for you. And you cannot do it if it creates a negative effect for you. Yes, we have many rulings of this type in Islam. If your intention is a bad intention, you should not engage. If your intention is a good intention, no problem, you can engage. When I am engaging with the opposite gender, yes, if there's no physical contact, if I am speaking with lust, this conversation is a problem. It is haram, according to all of the maraji', yes? If I have the wrong intentions. If I don't have the wrong intentions, I'm conversing regarding a professional matter, for example. This conversation is going to be completely halal, sometimes even necessary. It's part of your work, part of your job. Sometimes rulings are set up like this in Islam. Sometimes rulings are set up based on community. Meaning that you engaging in this deed, it may not create a negative effect for you per se. But out of 100 Muslims, if they engage in this deed, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 of them, it will ruin their life. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at this Muslim ummah, He says, I don't want this Muslim ummah to engage with this deed fundamentally. I don't even want this deed to be a norm within this community. Therefore I will declare it haram for everybody. Say, Ya Allah, it doesn't have a negative effect on me. Say, the ruling is legislated for what? The benefit and the wisdom of the whole community. First of all, when you say it doesn't have a negative effect on you, are you so sure about that? That's a discussion for another time, yes? You and I always say, oh, not me, I'm different from everybody else. Okay, you're different. I said, I'm a sheikh, I'm different from everybody else. No negative effect on me. Okay, let's just say that's true. But even if that was true, the legislation has come for what? Has come for the community. It's come for the society. And there are multiple examples of this. I will begin from some of the easier ones, then we'll get into some of the more delicate examples. The easiest of these is the issue of wine. Is it that every single person who drinks a drop of wine, all of a sudden he becomes an alcoholic and his life is ruined? No. The society that we live in, drinking is a norm. And it's not true that every single person, their life is ruined from A to Z because they had a sip of wine, for example. Na'udhu billah. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at the community and the society. He says, if this phenomenon makes its way into the community and the society, maybe not for 100 out of 100, but out of 60 out of 100, 50 out of 100, 40 out of 100, it will ruin their lives. Therefore, I will declare this haram for everybody. Even if someone says, well, I can show restraint myself. I can take a sip and not drink anymore. Maybe, and by the way, that's a maybe. Maybe, but even so, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I don't even want this to be a norm in your community. Therefore, number one, you cannot drink from it, even if it's a little sip of it. Even if it's not to a point where it intoxicates you. You cannot drink from it, it is haram for you, number one. Number two, beyond that, as it relates to wine in particular, not only can you not drink from it, it is najis as well. I don't even want it to be around you. Beyond that, if you sit at a table where someone else is drinking, you also can't be there. How many times do we have this question raised? Say, Sheikh, I'm just sitting there. And it's a valid question. There's nothing wrong with the question. But you have to understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is approaching this issue. He's not looking at you. He's looking at the whole Muslim ummah. He says, I don't even want this to be on the tables of the Muslim ummah. Therefore, He will legislate the ruling for the whole community. But when you look at it, you say, but I know people who take a sip of it and there's no problem in their life. Maybe. But you're not understanding the full picture. Because the ruling was legislated for the society. The rules of gambling is the same thing. Gambling and betting. Is it the case that everyone who bets on some little game or gambles a little bit, all of a sudden they have an addiction and their whole life is ruined? No. It's the reality of the matter. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at community and society, He says out of 100, 20, 30, 40, 50% of them, their lives will be ruined. Gambling addiction is one of the fastest growing addictions in this country. He says this, I don't even want this to be part of the community. Yes? And that's why some scholars, when it comes to those things that you play with, that are predominantly and overwhelmingly used for gambling, some scholars say even if you're not gambling with them, you can't play with them. Even if you're not betting on it. Yes? Ayatollah Sistani has ihtiyat wajib at the very least. Right? He says you have to take this precaution on this matter. Some of the other scholars, they have raised objection with regards to this issue. You say, why? But I'm not betting on it. I'm not gambling on it. Yes, maybe for you in particular, it doesn't create a problem. But the moment this game comes into the Muslim community, what happens? Then it starts to create problems. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at the community. He doesn't look at individuals only all the time. Yes, sometimes rulings are based like that. Sometimes no. Rulings are based on what? Based on community. Music is another example. When you look at the rulings of our maraji', including Ayatollah Sistani, does he say, the music that creates a problem for you, a negative effect in your heart is haram? Is that what his ruling is? No. His ruling is the type of music that normally people play in haram gatherings, in bad places. Places where people gather with the intention of committing what? Of haram. That's why they gather there. And that's why they play that music. That type of music, if you come across it, it is haram for you to listen to it. It affects you negatively, doesn't affect you negatively, is irrelevant. You might say, well, I listen to this, it doesn't create any problem for me. Maybe, but that's just you. Islam was legislated for 1400 years of Muslims and counting. Therefore, it's haram. It creates a negative effect for me. And again, that's a maybe. Don't forget that, yes? You and I say these things easily, but that's just a maybe. I'm saying, let's just say it doesn't create a negative effect, yes? Ayatollah Sistani says, look at the type of the music. If the type of the music is the type that is used commonly for these purposes, yes? Then you can't listen to it. Ayatollah Khamenei's ruling is the same, by the way. It's the same ruling as well. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to share these reasons with us at times, we wouldn't accept it from Him as we normally don't. Say this music is haram. Say no, I listen to it, it doesn't create any negative effect over me. Yes? We argue with His reasons. That's number 2. Moving on to number 3. Recite a salawat, please. The third reason why sometimes we would argue with him is because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the reason behind a ruling, we assume this is the only reason. Yes, for example, this pork is haram. Why is this pork haram? Just as an example, there is a bacteria in it, for example, it creates health issues for you, if we were to say that. Okay, well, what if I sanitize it now? Okay, but you don't know if this is the only problem with it. Yes? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to point out reasons for us, you and I would sit there and say, no, I sanitize it, it's no problem anymore. How do you know this is the only reason? Maybe there are 15 other reasons why you're not supposed to have this. The only time where you can sit there and say, this is the only reason, is if Quran tells you this is the only reason. Or Ahlul Bayt tell you what? This is the only reason. And sometimes they have done that. There are scenarios, though the numbers are very slim, but sometimes there are scenarios where Ahlul Bayt say, this is the problem with this. Okay, no problem. If you solve this problem, no problem. You can, engage in that deed. But many times where they haven't mentioned the reason behind it, you and I can't sit there and assume that yes, this scientific issue was the problem with this deed. Now science has solved this problem, therefore I can now engage in it. Before the problem was, for example, the meat of a pig or the flesh of a pig had this problem with it. Now they sanitize it, they change the genetics, whatever. Now there's no problem with it. How do you know this was the only reason? There could have been 5 other reasons that you don't know about. And this is why it's very important. Anytime we connect the rulings of Islam with a scientific fact, there are 2 points that we have to remember based on this. Number 1, you should almost never sit there and say the reason why this is haram is this scientific fact, because science also changes over time. So what should I do? Say maybe. Maybe this is the reason why. Gold, when men wear it, yes, their body reacts to it. There are studies done on this. Is this the reason why it's haram? Maybe. Maybe this is the reason why. Maybe tomorrow they come up, they find some sort of gold that has no effect on your blood pressure, for example. Can you say it's okay now all of a sudden? No. You don't know if this was the only reason, yes? So from the very beginning you say maybe, yeah, maybe this is the issue. That's number 1. Number 2 is that when you point to this scientific fact, you say maybe this is one of the reasons. Because maybe there are 10 other reasons for it as well. So you say maybe this is one of the reasons that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has declared this fact or this deed, for example, to be a haram deed. These are the reasons that show us that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to mention the reason behind the ruling, we would argue with him. Because our knowledge is very limited. That's the first reason why he doesn't share these rulings with us. Moving on to the second, and inshallah I'll be wrapping up. Number 2, and this is the most fundamental of all of them, is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to share all of these rulings with us, which in my belief and in my heart, I believe that if he wanted to, he could have done so. In one way or another. He could have found his own ways to do so. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to share all of these rulings with us, there would be no such a thing as faith and belief anymore. If I were to ask you right now, is it daytime, is it nighttime? And you went outside and you looked and you saw the sun. And you say, I went outside, the sun was outside, I saw it with my own 2 eyes, it's daytime. Would I come to you and say, MashaAllah, you have such great faith that it's daytime right now? Say, no, what faith, what belief are you talking about? I went outside, I looked, I saw the sun, it's daytime. There's no faith here. There's no belief here. Yes? This is just 2 + 2 = 4. I just looked, witnessed with my own eyes, khalas, I'm done. Faith comes when you don't know the reason behind something. That's the only time faith even presents itself as a concept. Otherwise, if you know the reason behind every single thing, then when are you going to quote unquote trust in him? You won't even have an opportunity to do that. Yes, sometimes he shares the rulings with you, the reasons with you to build your faith a little bit. But other times, now that you've built your faith, now you have to trust in him.
Therefore, if there is a religion that has shared the reason behind every single ruling, this is a religion that does not even allow for your faith to even build and grow. A religion, faith, belief, conviction, all of this comes into play where you can't see something with your own eyes, but you believe in it. You believe there's reason for it. You say, well, Shaykh, this is blind faith. I thought we're not supposed to have blind faith. This is not blind faith. You were proven the fundamentals of this religion, yes? You were proven to you that God exists. It was proven to you that this Quran is a miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was proven to you that the Prophet is a prophet. You've already built your trust over there. Now when you come to these details, some of them you have to trust in Him. The difference between blind faith and looking for the reason behind every single ruling is a very fine line. And when it comes to teaching our children about religion, this line is always blurred. Meaning those situations where we're supposed to provide proofs for them, we don't do it. We say, just trust in Allah. The Quran is a miracle. Why? Just trust, it's a miracle. I believed in this, your mother believes in this, our grandparents believe in this, you have to believe in this too. Don't ask questions about this. But then when it comes to the detailed rulings, then this parent all of a sudden becomes very creative. Say, no, if you pray 5 times a day, it's exercise, it's good for you. That's why you should pray 5 times a day. You're doing it the other way around. When it comes to those fundamentals, your child is supposed to ask the questions, you're supposed to provide the answers. That's where blind faith has no place in Islam. When it comes to these details, that's where faith has to exist in Islam. Islam is a balance of these two. And this is why the Quran tells us, yes, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We made you a moderate ummah. And this is why your qibla is always and also a moderate qibla as well. You are the line between blind faith and looking for a reason behind every single ruling. The reality is that you have to build your faith there. When it comes to these details, this is where your faith is supposed to grow. Otherwise, if any religion in the world tells you the reason behind everything, how are you going to build trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How are you going to build faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How are you going to do something because He has told you to do something? If you already know the reason behind it, I'll just do it because of that reason. When you go and work because of Allah has told you. No, you go and work because you know if you work, you get money. If He were to tell me the reason behind everything, there would be no such a thing as the religion of Islam. Therefore, sometimes He has told you, sometimes on purpose, He has not told you. And this is a concept that in multiple ahadith of ours is pointed out. Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will test His servants with those things that they do not know the reason behind it. Because if they knew the reason behind it, it's very easy to do. It's no problem. I'll do it anyways. He says, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests His servants to break their arrogance even at times. He will test them with those things that they do not know the reasons behind them. With that, inshallah, we'll bring tonight's talk to an end.